Good morning, Little Masters, and welcome back to today's Tolkien Times. I'm the Man of the West, also from the Prancing Pony podcast. Let's get week 31 underway with another Mailbag Monday. Now, Sandra W. wrote in a few months ago, regarding Orcrist in the Goblin Caves of the Hobbit, the goblins are said to have known the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time. They had called it Orcrist, Goblin Cleaver, but the goblins simply called it Biter. They hated it. Similarly with Glamdring, the goblins just called it Beater and hated it worse than Biter if possible. My question is, Sandra asks, how did the goblins recognize swords that were used in wars thousands of years before? That is a really good question, as in, I have no definitive answer for you kind of good question. So that means it's time to speculate, and we're going to start with the text in question as always. Both of these moments are from the chapter Overhill and Underhill, and it's after the capture of Thorin and company by the goblins. So after Thorin tries to explain why he and his folk are in the area, I don't remember, maybe there was something about a good restaurant on Yelp, one of the goblin defenders holds out the sword that Thorin had been wearing, and it was the one that he'd found in the troll's lair. And that's where we'll pick up. The great goblin gave a truly awful howl of rage when he looked at it, and all his soldiers gnashed their teeth, clashed their shields, and stamped. They knew the sword at once. It had killed hundreds of goblins in its time, when the fair elves of Gondolin hunted them in the hills or did battle before their walls. They had called it Orcrist, Goblin Cleaver, but the goblins called it simply Biter. They hated it, and hated worse anyone that carried it. "Murderers and elf friends," the great goblin shouted. "Slash them, beat them, bite them, gnash them, take them away to dark holes full of snakes and never let them see the light again." He was in such a rage that he jumped off his seat and himself rushed at Thorin with his mouth open. All right, then. Nice guy, that great goblin. So after Gandalf skewers the great goblin with his own sword, we read about that one. He took out his sword again, and again it flashed in the dark by itself. It burned with a rage that made it gleam if goblins were about. Now it was bright as blue flame for delight in the killing of the great lord of the cave. It made no trouble whatever of cutting through the goblin chains and setting all the prisoners free as quickly as possible. This sword's name was Glamdring the Foehammer, if you remember. The goblins just called it Beater and hated it worse than Biter, if possible. Okay, we've read the passages, and honestly, we're no closer to understanding why the goblins would recognize these swords, so let's think this through. First, let's come up with a year that the tale begins of the mighty Glamdring, the Foehammer. When would the orcs, the goblins, first have encountered this weapon? Now, I'm going to speculate that this might have happened as early as the Nirnaeth Arnoediad, where Turgon, the king of Gondolin, who bore Glamdring originally, was said to have hewed his way to the side of his brother Fingon, presumably hewing his way through some goblins. Now, that was in First Age 472, so you have 118 years to the end of the First Age, then 3,441 years in the Second Age, and then another 2,941 years in the Third Age, so actually pretty much exactly 6,500 years. So how does a sword that did some mighty things 6,500 years ago, and then dropped off the face of Arda, relatively speaking, become so well known among Third Age goblins in the Misty Mountains, half a continent away from Gondolin? Now, there are some interesting possibilities for an in-universe explanation. First, in Myths Transformed, which you can find in Morgoth's Ring, we're told very briefly about the Bulldog. Not Bulldog, Boldog, B-O-L-D-O-G. And that name may not be an individual orc's name, but as Christopher Tolkien explains, either a title or else the name of a kind of creature, the orc-formed Maiar, only less formidable than the Balrogs. A Maia spirit in orc form? Well, what if the great goblin were one of these bulldog? A Maia spirit who'd been around since before the First Age even began. He'd certainly recognize it. Well, there are a couple of problems with that theory. One, the great goblin's pretty underwhelming for a Maia. And two, all the goblins recognize the sword, so that shoots that theory down. The goblins and orcs may not be all that bright. I doubt they're winning any Nobel Prizes anytime soon, but they do have enough intelligence and culture that the idea of an oral history telling of the battles with these swords and describing them in detail is quite possible, with the intervening time actually making these swords even more terrifying in legend than they are in real life. And honestly, that seems to me the most likely in-universe explanation is just oral history. But the truth is most likely an out-of-universe explanation. Now, one of the things that might help you make sense of this is remembering that Tolkien didn't really place The Hobbit directly, let alone accurately, into his Middle-earth timeline when he wrote it. The story didn't even originally take place in the same Middle-earth that we know from The Lord of the Rings, as he explains in letter number 257, first talking about his First Age legends, what we know today as the Great Tales. He writes, "The germ of my attempt to write legends of my own to fit my private languages was the tragic tale of the hapless Kullervo in the Finnish Kalevala. It remains a major matter in the legends of the First Age, which I hope to publish as the Silmarillion, though as the Children of Húrin, it is entirely changed except in the tragic ending. The second point was the writing out of my head of the fall of Gondolin, the story of Idril and Eärendil during sick leave from the army in 1917, and by the original version of the tale of Luthien, Tinuviel, and Beren, later in the same year." Now, later in that letter, he says that by the time The Hobbit appeared, 1937, this matter of the elder days was in coherent form. The Hobbit was not intended to have anything to do with it. I had the habit, while my children were still young, of inventing and telling orally, sometimes of writing down, children's stories for their private amusement, according to the notions I then had, and many still have, of what these should be like in style and attitude. None of these have been published. The Hobbit was intended to be one of them. It had no necessary connection with the mythology. And the letter goes on to explain that Tolkien saw Bilbo's ring as the thing that could be connected with my mythology, but that he had to make it of more importance for the sequel, so he linked it with the originally quite casual reference to the necromancer, whose function, he says, was hardly more than to provide a reason for Gandalf going away. So that's part of it, but let's go to part two of this argument. As we've seen before, even though he didn't intend for this to be set in that particular mythology, he still drew on many of his First Age story elements in The Hobbit, despite his claim that it wasn't intended to have anything to do with it. Is the Arkenstone a Silmaril? No, but kinda. And yes, I did a video on that. Is the unnamed king of the Woodland Realm actually Thingol? Pretty much yes, but of course no. So as these First Age legends percolated in his mind and sometimes showed up in the story despite his intent to the contrary, it seems quite possible that at the time Tolkien wrote this portion of the story, this event, the encounter with the goblins and the Goblin Wars, wasn't happening 6,500 years before the goblins captured the dwarves. Instead, the goblins' encountering of these swords would have happened maybe only a few hundred years before instead of a few thousand years before. And so their knowledge of history wouldn't have to be as ancient. Truth is, that's the best I have for you on this, Sandra. I'm sorry that there's no strong in-universe answer for this one, but that seems to be the case for a few questions coming out of The Hobbit. Well, folks, that wraps it up for Mailbag Monday. If you have a question that you'd like me to answer, please email it to barliman@theprancingponypodcast.com. Let him know it's for today's Tolkien Times, and I'll get to it as soon as possible, with priority going to supporters of the show on Patreon. Speaking of which, please visit patreon.com/TolkienTimes to find out how you can help the show, get an ad-free feed, become part of my content council, get bonus episodes, and more. Join me again tomorrow on today's Tolkien Times for Tolkien Tuesday as we learn more about the professor himself. Now, if you're watching this on YouTube, please be sure to like, subscribe, and turn on your notifications. Please follow or subscribe in your podcast apps, and follow @Tolkien Times on Instagram, Twitter, and TikTok. Finally, as Faramir says, go with the goodwill of all good men.